The morning detective Marcus Thompson arrived at the downtown precinct should have been ordinary, but the emergency dispatch board lit up like a Christmas tree with calls that made no sense. Reports flooded in from every district of the city, people attacking others with their teeth, victims rising after being pronounced dead, chaos spreading through the streets faster than any riot Marcus had witnessed in his 15 years on the force. He grabbed his radio and called his partner, Officer Diana Martinez, who was already 3 blocks away responding to what she thought was a domestic disturbance. Her voice crackled through with panic he'd never heard from the usually unshakable veteran. She described a scene that defied logic. A mailman she'd known for years had turned on his own family, his eyes vacant and white, his movements jerky but relentless. Before Marcus could respond, her screams filled the radio followed by static, and his blood ran cold. Marcus didn't hesitate. He commandeered the nearest patrol car and raced toward her last known location, but the streets had transformed into a nightmare landscape in the span of 20 minutes. Abandoned vehicles blocked intersections, their doors hanging open as if drivers had fled mid-journey. Smoke rose from a grocery store where he'd bought coffee just yesterday morning. Groups of people sprinted past, some covered in blood, all wearing expressions of pure terror. Then he saw them, the infected, the turned, the things that used to be his neighbors and fellow citizens. They moved with unnatural determination, chasing down the living with single-minded hunger. Marcus had trained for active shooters, natural disasters, and terrorist attacks, but nothing in his career prepared him for the dead refusing to stay dead. He spotted Diana's patrol car overturned near Madison Avenue, and his heart sank until he saw movement inside a nearby pharmacy. Through the shattered window, Diana waved frantically, barricaded inside with a handful of survivors including a young EMT named Jackson Rivera and a high school teacher named Rebecca Walsh who clutched a baseball bat with white knuckles. Marcus crashed through the pharmacy's back entrance and helped reinforce the doors with shelving units while Diana quickly explained what she'd learned from Jackson, who'd been at Ground Zero when the first victims arrived at Memorial Hospital. The infection spread through bites, turning victims within minutes, creating an exponential nightmare that overwhelmed every emergency system simultaneously. The group could hear the moans and shuffling footsteps of dozens of infected gathering outside, drawn by noise and movement. Rebecca mentioned that her school had emergency protocols and a reinforced gymnasium that could serve as a temporary shelter, located just 8 blocks north. Marcus calculated their odds. Staying put meant inevitable discovery as the infected seemed capable of mindless persistence, while moving through streets full of those things risked exposure but offered potential safety in numbers. The decision was made when infected hands began breaking through the pharmacy's front windows, their decaying fingers clawing at the glass with horrifying determination. The group of 4 burst through the back exit into the alley, and Marcus led them through a route he'd memorized from years of patrol, cutting through service corridors and back streets most civilians never knew existed. They picked up survivors along the way: Thomas Bennett, a construction worker with a crowbar who'd watched his entire crew fall; Jennifer Hayes, a software engineer who'd rappelled down her office building's exterior; and old Henry Patterson, a Korean War veteran who moved with surprising agility for his 78 years and carried his grandfather's hunting rifle. Each intersection brought new horrors and difficult choices: which survivor to help when they couldn't save everyone, when to hide and when to run, who among the screaming masses was infected and who was simply terrified. By the time they reached Roosevelt High School, their group had swelled to 15 people, and the infected horde pursuing them numbered in the hundreds. Marcus and Thomas barricaded the main entrance while Jackson attended to the wounded, and Rebecca, drawing on her years teaching disaster preparedness, began organizing survivors into teams. As the sun set on that first day, painting the smoke-filled sky in ominous reds and oranges, Marcus stood on the school roof and watched his city burn, understanding with crushing certainty that the world they'd known that morning was gone forever, and survival would require every ounce of courage, intelligence, and unity they could muster against the relentless tide of the dead. The first night in Roosevelt High School tested every survivor's resolve as the infected surrounded the building, their collective moaning creating a sound that drilled into everyone's psyche like a living nightmare. Marcus organized watch rotations while Rebecca transformed her former classroom into a command center, spreading out a city map and marking known safe zones based on radio chatter that was becoming increasingly sparse and desperate. Jennifer proved invaluable when she managed to hack into the school's PA system and connect it to emergency bands, allowing them to monitor both police channels and civilian broadcasts, though the news they gathered painted a grim picture of a city collapsing into chaos with similar reports coming from neighboring states. Jackson set up a makeshift medical station in the nurse's office, taking inventory of their limited supplies and grimly noting they had enough bandages and antibiotics for maybe a week if they were careful, but nothing to treat the infection itself. Once someone was bitten, they had minutes before the transformation began, and the only mercy they could offer was isolation or a quick end that nobody wanted to discuss but everyone understood. As dawn broke on the second day, the group discovered they weren't alone in the school when sounds emerged from the locked auditorium in the East Wing. Thomas and Marcus approached cautiously, weapons ready, and found Coach Patrick Sullivan had barricaded himself inside with 12 students who'd been at early morning basketball practice when the outbreak began. Among them was Sullivan's own daughter, Emily, a sharp-minded senior who'd kept detailed notes of everything they'd observed about the infected's behavior patterns. She explained that the creatures were drawn to sound and movement but seemed almost blind in complete darkness, that they couldn't climb ladders or navigate complex obstacles, and that their bodies showed progressive decay suggesting they might eventually deteriorate, though how long that would take remained unknown. This intelligence transformed their situation from hopeless to merely desperate, and Marcus immediately saw the tactical advantages they could exploit. Meanwhile, Diana had been conducting a full sweep of the building and discovered the school's cafeteria had enough canned goods and dry storage to feed their group of 27 people for approximately 3 weeks, maybe 4 if they rationed strictly, but water would become critical since the taps were already running brown and municipal services had clearly collapsed. The fragile peace shattered that afternoon when a new survivor arrived, pounding on the reinforced gymnasium doors and screaming for help as a pack of infected closed in behind him. His name was Vincent Crawford, a businessman still wearing his torn suit, and he brought information that changed everything. He'd escaped from a government emergency bunker beneath the federal building downtown where he'd overheard military communications before the facility was overrun. According to Vincent, the outbreak had started at a biotech research facility outside the city 3 days before anyone realized what was happening, and the government had known about the infection's potential for at least 18 hours before it went public, wasting precious time trying to contain information instead of containing the outbreak. More critically, Vincent had heard coordinates for evacuation zones being established at military bases outside the quarantine perimeter, but reaching them meant traveling 40 miles through infested territory with no guarantee the safe zones still existed or would accept refugees. His revelation split the group immediately. Some like Henry and Thomas argued they should fortify their position and wait for proper rescue, while others like Jennifer and Emily insisted staying put meant slow starvation and eventual death when their supplies ran out. The debate became moot when Rebecca, who'd been monitoring the radio, suddenly went pale and turned up the volume so everyone could hear the emergency broadcast. A cold, automated voice announced that the city had been declared a Level 5 contamination zone, that all bridges and highways were being destroyed to prevent the infection spread, and that any remaining survivors should shelter in place until further notice, though the message's tone suggested no further notice would ever come. As the broadcast repeated on an endless loop, Marcus watched his group process the abandonment, saw hope drain from faces and replaced by either resignation or determination. He knew they stood at a crossroads that would define whether they remained merely survivors or became something more, a unified force capable of fighting back against impossible odds. That evening, as infected continued their mindless vigil around the school's perimeter, Marcus called everyone together and posed the question that would determine all their fates: did they wait here to die slowly, or did they risk everything on a desperate journey toward the promised evacuation zones, knowing that the path ahead would test every limit they possessed? The vote wasn't unanimous, but democracy in the apocalypse operated on survival instinct rather than perfect consensus, and by morning 17 members of their group had committed to the journey toward the evacuation zones while 10 chose to remain at Roosevelt High under Henry's leadership, including several of Coach Sullivan's students who couldn't face the horror of traveling through infected territory. Marcus spent hours dividing their resources fairly, ensuring those who stayed had enough supplies and defensive capabilities to hold the school for months if necessary, while those departing took weapons, portable food, and the information Vincent had memorized about the route to Firebase Romeo, a military installation that represented their best hope for sanctuary. The farewell was harder than anyone anticipated. Henry gripped Marcus's shoulder with surprising strength and made him promise to send help if the safe zone was real, while Emily embraced her former teacher Rebecca and whispered that she was terrified but more afraid of dying without fighting back. As the departing group assembled in the loading dock area, Marcus looked at the faces depending on him: Diana with her unwavering courage, Jackson with his medical knowledge, Rebecca with her organizational brilliance, Thomas with his raw strength, Jennifer with her technical skills, Vincent with his inside information, Coach Sullivan who refused to leave without Emily, and 9 others who'd each proven their worth during the nightmarish days in the school. Their plan relied on information Jennifer had extracted from traffic camera archives before the internet finally died completely. She'd mapped a route using service roads and industrial areas that theoretically avoided major population centers where infected would be concentrated in massive hordes. They'd organized into 3 vehicles Thomas had hotwired from the staff parking lot, a reinforced maintenance truck that would lead their convoy, a school bus with windows covered in metal grating, and a cargo van bringing up the rear. Marcus established strict protocols: no stopping except for emergencies, no honking or unnecessary noise, and if anyone was bitten during the journey, they'd be isolated immediately because one infection could doom them all. The group departed at dawn when infected were less active according to Emily's observations, smashing through the weakest point in the horde surrounding the school and accelerating onto the abandoned streets before the creatures could swarm their vehicles. For the first hour, the journey proceeded better than Marcus dared hope. They navigated through suburban areas where infected were scattered and easily avoided, past several wrecked military convoys that yielded extra weapons and ammunition, and even found an intact gas station where they refueled without incident. The illusion of progress shattered when they reached the Carson Bridge, their only route across the river that divided the city from the rural highways leading to Firebase Romeo. Vincent's face went white as they approached because the bridge he'd crossed just days earlier was now blocked by an elaborate barricade constructed from vehicles, shipping containers, and razor wire. More alarming were the armed figures visible on the barricade's upper levels, clearly living humans who opened fire the moment the convoy came into range, bullets sparking off the maintenance truck's hood as Marcus swerved into cover behind an overturned delivery truck. Using the vehicle's CB radio, a harsh voice identified itself as Nathaniel Cross, leader of what he called the River Watch Coalition, and he declared that the bridge was closed to all refugees because his community couldn't risk infection or resource depletion. Marcus tried reasoning, explaining they only wanted passage and would share fuel and weapons as toll, but Nathaniel's response was coldly pragmatic: every survivor who crossed meant competition for dwindling supplies at whatever destination they sought, and the River Watch had decided their best chance was eliminating that competition while establishing control over critical infrastructure. Diana spotted movement through her binoculars and cursed. Nathaniel's people were herding infected toward their position, using air horns and fireworks to drive hundreds of the creatures directly at the trapped convoy. Marcus had perhaps 10 minutes before the horde arrived and their vehicles became death traps, while behind them more infected were already shuffling into view, attracted by the gunfire. Jennifer frantically studied her maps and found only 2 alternatives: backtrack 12 miles through increasingly dangerous territory to find another bridge that was probably also compromised, or follow the riverbank to an old industrial complex where Thomas remembered there used to be a railway bridge, though he hadn't been there in 20 years and couldn't guarantee it still stood or was passable. The group looked to Marcus for leadership, and he felt the crushing weight of their survival resting on decisions made in seconds with incomplete information. Emily suddenly grabbed the CB radio and broadcast on all channels, her young voice cutting through with desperate inspiration. She announced they were immune carriers with vital information about the infection's origin and were willing to trade that intelligence for safe passage to anyone listening. It was a complete bluff, but in the moment before Nathaniel could respond, another voice crackled through the static, female and commanding, identifying herself as Captain Allison Drake of the National Guard's 47th Unit, broadcasting from Firebase Romeo itself, stating that if Marcus's group could verify their position and survive for 2 hours, she would dispatch a relief team to extract them because every survivor who'd witnessed the outbreak's beginning was considered a critical intelligence asset worth risking resources to recover. Marcus verified their coordinates to Captain Drake while simultaneously ordering everyone into defensive positions because 2 hours might as well have been 2 days when hundreds of infected were shambling toward them from multiple directions and Nathaniel's people continued sporadic gunfire to keep them pinned down. Thomas backed the maintenance truck against a concrete barrier to create a choke point, while Coach Sullivan and Diana organized fighters on the school bus's roof where metal grating provided both protection and elevated firing positions. Jennifer worked frantically to boost their radio signal, maintaining contact with Captain Drake, who explained that her relief team was mobilizing but had to navigate through contested territory and couldn't simply fly helicopters into a hot zone without reconnaissance, especially with hostile survivors shooting at anything that moved. Jackson prepared the cargo van as a fallback position and medical station, his hands steady despite the terror in his eyes as the moaning of the approaching horde grew from a distant murmur to a deafening chorus that resonated in everyone's chest like a second heartbeat. Vincent climbed to the highest vantage point and began calling out threats as he spotted them, infected clustering near their eastern flank, Nathaniel's people repositioning on the barricade with what looked like a mounted machine gun, and something worse that made his voice crack with fear, a mass of infected numbering easily over 1,000 shambling down the main highway behind them, drawn by the commotion like sharks to blood in water. The first wave hit their position within minutes, and the survivors learned the difference between fighting isolated infected in controlled environments versus holding ground against a relentless mass assault. Marcus fired methodically, each shot dropping an infected creature, but for every one that fell 2 more took its place, climbing over the bodies of the fallen without hesitation or self-preservation. Emily proved surprisingly capable with the hunting rifle Henry had gifted her, her basketball-trained hand-eye coordination translating into accurate headshots that cleared threats before they reached the barricade. Rebecca swung a reinforced bat with desperate strength, protecting Jackson as he dragged a wounded survivor named Michael Porter back from the line after the young man's leg was gashed by jagged metal rather than infected teeth, a critical distinction that meant he could still be saved. The infected pressed against their vehicles with combined weight that made the metal groan, their decaying hands scraping and clawing, their white eyes seeing nothing but registering the living presence before them as something to consume. Thomas discovered that improvised Molotov cocktails created from the gas station supplies were devastatingly effective, turning clusters of infected into walking pyres that stumbled blindly before collapsing, though the smoke created new problems by reducing visibility and irritating everyone's lungs. 40 minutes into their desperate stand, Nathaniel's voice returned on the CB radio with a proposal that revealed the depths humanity could sink when survival trumped morality. He offered to stop shooting and even clear a path through his barricade if Marcus's group would leave behind half their weapons and all their ammunition, essentially ensuring they'd be defenseless when they encountered the next threat. Marcus told him exactly what he could do with that proposal using language that made Rebecca wince despite their circumstances, but the exchange gave Jennifer an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. She'd noticed that Nathaniel's people were clustered on the bridge's western side, meaning the eastern support structures were undefended, and the old maintenance access catwalks might still be intact beneath the bridge deck. If a small team could reach the river's edge, they might be able to cross under the bridge while the main group held position, then create a distraction on the far side that would force Nathaniel to divide his attention or flee entirely. Marcus hated the plan because it meant splitting their already small force, but Diana volunteered immediately, and Thomas insisted his construction experience made him essential for navigating unstable infrastructure, while Vincent surprised everyone by stepping forward and quietly stating he owed a debt for being accepted into the group despite arriving with nothing but bad news and unverifiable claims. The 3 departed during the heaviest fighting when their absence would be least noticed, sliding down the riverbank while Coach Sullivan and Emily intensified their covering fire to mask the movement. Marcus watched them disappear into the shadows beneath the bridge and felt the familiar weight of command, the knowledge that his decision sent people into danger and sometimes to their deaths. The infected pressed harder, and several breached the initial perimeter before being put down at close range in struggles that left survivors drenched in contaminated blood and praying it wouldn't find entry through cuts or mucous membranes. Jackson worked miracles keeping people fighting, distributing painkillers and adrenaline shots scavenged from his medical supplies, while Rebecca coordinated ammunition distribution to ensure no position ran dry at critical moments. Captain Drake's voice provided periodic updates. The relief team had encountered delays, they needed another 40 minutes, hold position and stay alive. Then Vincent's voice crackled through a handheld radio, breathless and urgent, announcing they'd crossed successfully and were in position, and what happened next would either save them all or doom both groups, but either way Marcus needed to get everyone ready to move fast because the bridge was about to become very loud and very dangerous. The explosion that ripped through the bridge's eastern support towers was far larger than Marcus had anticipated, and he realized with a mixture of pride and horror that Thomas must have used every explosive they'd scavenged from the wrecked military convoys. Flames erupted skyward as secondary detonations triggered in sequence, collapsing an entire section of Nathaniel's carefully constructed barricade and sending his people scrambling in panic as burning debris rained down on their positions. Vincent's voice screamed through the radio for the convoy to move now, right now, because the distraction wouldn't last and the explosion had drawn every infected creature within a mile toward the bridge like moths to a catastrophic flame. Marcus didn't hesitate, he gunned the maintenance truck's engine and smashed through the weakened infected line, trusting that Coach Sullivan and Emily would get the bus moving and the others would follow in the cargo van. The vehicles tore across the bridge deck while Nathaniel's surviving people were too busy fleeing or fighting fires to maintain organized resistance, though a few desperate shots still rang out and one bullet spiderwebbed the truck's windshield inches from Marcus's face. He spotted Diana, Thomas, and Vincent emerging from the smoke on the far side and executed a dangerous maneuver, swinging the truck sideways to provide cover while the three sprinted aboard, Thomas bleeding from a nasty gash across his forehead but grinning like a maniac and shouting that nobody could say construction workers didn't know how to make an impression. The convoy roared off the bridge just as the infected horde reached its center, and Marcus allowed himself a moment of savage satisfaction imagining Nathaniel's fortified position being overrun by the very creatures he'd tried to weaponize against other survivors. But the celebration died quickly when Jennifer's voice called out a devastating observation. The cargo van wasn't following them, and radio contact with the team inside had gone silent. Marcus slammed on the brakes despite every instinct screaming to keep moving, and through the smoke and chaos he could see the van had crashed into the bridge's rail, its front end crumpled and steam rising from the destroyed engine. Emily grabbed binoculars and counted 4 figures stumbling from the wreckage including Jackson, Rebecca, and 2 others named Michelle Torres and Daniel Kim, but they were surrounded by infected on all sides with no clear path to safety. Diana was already moving before Marcus could speak, grabbing rope from their supplies and rallying volunteers for a rescue operation that would require split-second timing and courage that bordered on insanity. Coach Sullivan positioned the school bus to create a barrier while Thomas and Vincent provided covering fire, their ammunition expenditure reckless but necessary as Diana led a team on foot back onto that nightmare bridge, racing against time and the shambling dead. What followed was the longest 4 minutes of Marcus's life, watching Diana and her rescue team reach the crashed van, watching them physically drag the stunned survivors through gaps in the infected horde, watching Rebecca trip and nearly go down before Jackson hauled her upright with strength born of pure desperation, watching infected hands grab at clothes and flesh while bullets and makeshift weapons cleared inches of space at a time. They were 10 feet from safety when Daniel Kim screamed, and everyone saw the infected teeth embedded in his forearm, saw the terrible understanding flood his eyes as he realized what that meant for him and everyone he might endanger. He didn't hesitate. The young accountant who'd survived by hiding in a bank vault for 3 days shoved Michelle toward the waiting hands of the rescue team and then turned back into the horde, sacrificing himself to buy seconds that made the difference between survival and death for his companions. Diana got everyone aboard the bus just as Captain Drake's voice burst through the radio announcing the relief team was 3 minutes out, coming in fast with armored vehicles and heavy weapons, converging on the coordinates Jennifer was broadcasting on emergency frequencies. The National Guard arrived like the cavalry from old Western films that Marcus had watched as a kid, 3 massive military vehicles equipped with mounted guns that tore through infected ranks with brutal efficiency. Captain Drake herself led the operation, a scarred veteran who'd clearly seen hell in the past weeks and developed the hard edge necessary for survival in this new world. She established a secure perimeter and oversaw the transfer of Marcus's group to the military convoy, her medics immediately examining everyone for bites or infections while soldiers distributed water and rations that tasted like the finest meal any survivor had eaten in days. As they pulled away from the bridge, now completely overrun by thousands of infected that would eventually disperse but for now created an impassable barrier, Marcus conducted a mental count of his people and felt the weight of the names they'd lost: Daniel Kim, Michael Porter who'd succumbed to his injuries, and 3 others who'd been with them since Roosevelt High. Emily sat quietly beside Rebecca, both women processing trauma in silence, while Jackson methodically cleaned his medical supplies with shaking hands that betrayed his emotional state despite his calm expression. Captain Drake outlined their destination as she drove. Firebase Romeo was 15 miles ahead, a fortified military installation where over 2,000 survivors had gathered under protection of the largest remaining organized military unit in the region, and while conditions weren't comfortable, they represented humanity's best chance at establishing a defendable sanctuary from which they might eventually begin the long process of reclaiming their world from the relentless dead. Firebase Romeo appeared on the horizon like a vision from another world, its reinforced walls topped with spotlights and armed sentries, its perimeter cleared of infected for hundreds of yards in every direction through systematic patrols and controlled burns that left the earth scorched but secure. Marcus felt the tension drain from his shoulders as the military convoy passed through multiple checkpoints, each one manned by professional soldiers who maintained discipline and protocol even as civilization crumbled beyond the walls. Captain Drake escorted them through processing where medical teams conducted thorough examinations, decontamination protocols were rigidly enforced, and every newcomer was quarantined for 12 hours to ensure no infections had slipped through, a harsh policy that had saved the base from internal outbreaks that had destroyed other safe zones. The facility housed an overwhelming mix of humanity, families with young children, elderly survivors, former government officials, scientists, military personnel, and ordinary people who'd survived extraordinary circumstances through luck, skill, or sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. As Marcus's group was assigned to barracks in Sector 7, he noticed the organization was impressive but the strain was visible: rationed food portions that left everyone hungry, exhausted soldiers pulling double shifts, and the underlying current of fear that their sanctuary might be temporary rather than permanent. Rebecca immediately found purpose by volunteering for the Civilian Coordination Committee, her teaching and organizational skills making her invaluable for managing resources and resolving disputes among traumatized survivors learning to coexist in cramped conditions. Jackson joined the medical corps and within hours was assisting with surgeries, training new medics, and sharing observations about infected behavior patterns that helped refine the base's defensive strategies. Jennifer disappeared into the communications center where her technical expertise contributed to efforts at establishing contact with other survivor enclaves, mapping safe zones, and potentially locating the source of the outbreak through analyzing data from government servers she accessed through military networks. Thomas found brotherhood among the construction crews reinforcing walls and building expansions to accommodate the steady trickle of refugees still arriving daily, while Emily's detailed observations about infected behavior earned her a position with the tactical planning unit despite her age. Diana remained by Marcus's side as they met with Colonel Raymond Shaw, the base commander, a grizzled officer who laid out the reality of their situation with uncompromising honesty. Firebase Romeo was surviving but not thriving. Supplies would last perhaps 6 months with current population levels, and unless they established sustainable food production and expanded their secured territory, the base would become a slow death trap rather than a genuine sanctuary. The meeting that changed everything occurred on their 3rd day when Vincent's information about the outbreak's origin at the biotech facility finally reached the scientists working in the base's research laboratory. Dr. Margaret Foster, a virologist who'd escaped from a CDC facility, believed that if they could access the original research data, they might understand the infection's mechanism and potentially develop a treatment or vaccine, though she emphasized this was desperate hope rather than guaranteed solution. Colonel Shaw assembled a volunteer strike team for what he called Operation Redemption, a high-risk expedition to the abandoned biotech facility that would require fighting through heavily infested territory to retrieve data that might not even exist anymore. Marcus volunteered immediately, as did Diana, Thomas, and surprisingly Coach Sullivan, who explained that his daughter Emily deserved a future worth surviving for, and sitting behind walls waiting for slow starvation wasn't the legacy he intended to leave. The team spent a week in intensive preparation, training with military special forces, studying infected behavior patterns, and planning every detail of an operation that would either provide humanity with genuine hope or become a suicide mission remembered only by those left behind. The night before deployment, Marcus stood on the firebase walls and looked out at the dark landscape dotted with shambling infected, still relentless, still hungry, still representing an existential threat to everything humanity had built over millennia. Emily approached quietly and stood beside him, this young woman who'd grown harder and wiser than any teenager should have to become, and she asked if he thought they could really win, really reclaim their world from the dead. Marcus considered lying, offering false comfort, but respected her too much for that. He told her the truth, that he didn't know if they'd win, but he knew they'd fight, that every day they survived was a victory against impossible odds, that Daniel Kim and Henry Patterson and everyone they'd lost had bought them time with their sacrifices, and the only way to honor those deaths was to keep pushing forward, keep hoping, keep standing united against the relentless darkness. As dawn broke over Firebase Romeo, Marcus joined his team and prepared to venture back into hell, but this time not just to survive, but to strike back, carrying with him the desperate hope that humanity's story wasn't ending but rather beginning a new chapter written in courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to reclaim their world from the dead.